everyone, my name is Natasha and I'm the Women's Ministry Associate here at Emmanuel. Welcome to our series on the Minor Prophets. Today we are going through the book of Obadiah, so take a minute to read it together and then watch the Bible Project video.
The book of the prophet Obadiah. This is the shortest book in the whole Old Testament. It's a mere 21 verses. And at first glance, it does not look very promising. It's a series of divine judgment poems against the ancient people of Edom, which was a nation that neighbored Israel on the other side of the Dead Sea. However, there is way more going on here. So, first, here's the backstory. The people of Edom were unique because they had a shared ancestry with the Israelites. They both belonged to the family of Abraham, who, with Sarah, had their son Isaac, who, with his wife Rebekah, had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Now, the book of Genesis told us the story of these two brothers, and to say the very least, they had a tense relationship. They each later received the names Israel and Edom, which eventually became the name of the families that descended from them. And these families replayed the same difficult relationship of their ancestors. Israel and Edom had enormous tensions throughout the centuries, but they still shared that family bond. And it's that bond that was betrayed and shattered in the tragic events of Jerusalem's fall to Babylon. So when Israel was invaded and conquered by Babylon, the people of Edom took advantage by plundering other Israelite cities and then capturing and even killing Israelite refugees. Now, in other prophetic books, God held Israel's neighbors accountable for this kind of violence. And so here, Obadiah does the same for Edom. The short book has two halves. The first part is a series of accusations against the leaders of Edom, specifically for their pride and self-exaltation. Literally, as they lived up high in the desert rocks, but also metaphorically, they truly believed they were superior to the Israelites. And it's that pride that led the Edomites to not just stand idly by when Babylon came to destroy Jerusalem, but actually to participate in the destruction. And so God says through Obadiah that Edom will be brought down from their height and destroyed. As they have done to Israel, so it will be done to them. Now, right when you think you're going to hear more about how Edom will meet its doom, the topic suddenly shifts in verse 15. We hear this: "The day of the Lord is near against all nations." Now, why do we all of a sudden shift from Edom now to all nations? This verse is a hinge piece, and it links the first half of the book to the second half, where Obadiah announces the day of the Lord, but not only for Edom. He widens his focus to include all nations. And Obadiah says that all prideful nations that act like Edom will face God's justice in the same way. They'll fall from their prideful heights and come to ruin. Now, the combination of these two sections, one about Edom, the other about all nations, shows us why Obadiah was so interested in this tiny southern neighbor of Israel. Obadiah sees Edom's pride and fall as an example, an image of how God will one day confront the pride of all nations and bring about their fall too. It's hardly coincidental that in Hebrew, the word Edom, or Edom, is spelled with the exact same letters as the word humanity, or in Hebrew, Adam. In Obadiah, Edom's rise and fall is a parable of how God's justice will one day oppose pride and violence among all nations in the day of the Lord. But as in all the prophets, God's judgment is never his final word. Specifically, remember the conclusion of the two books that came right before Obadiah, Joel and Amos. Joel had painted a picture of what will happen after the day of the Lord against all nations. He said that God would perform a new act of salvation in Jerusalem, and that all who humbled themselves and called upon him would be delivered. And in the conclusion of Amos, he said that after the day of the Lord has judged Israel's evil, God would raise up the house of David and build a new kingdom for Israel that would include Edom and all the nations called by my name. And so the book of Obadiah has been placed right after Joel and then Amos to expand on these very promises about the hope of God's kingdom over all of the nations. And so the book concludes with a very hopeful future. God says he's going to restore his kingdom over the new Jerusalem, that he'll repopulate it with a faithful remnant. And then from there, God's kingdom will expand to include all the territory and nations around Israel. And so this little book contributes to the larger portrait of God's justice and faithfulness that we're seeing in the prophets. The ancient pride and betrayal of the people of Edom becomes an example of the greater human condition, all of the ways that we betray and hurt each other in God's good world. But there's hope, Obadiah says. Edom's downfall points to the day when God will deal with evil in our world, but also bring his healing kingdom of peace over all the nations. And that's what the book of Obadiah is all about.
After reading this short book of Obadiah and watching the Bible Project video, I can't help but ask, so what? So what does this mean for me personally? In verse 3, it talks about the pride of Edom's hearts, deceiving them and the idea that no one can bring them down. The following verses go on to talk about how Edom, remember from the video that's Esau's family, will be ransacked and that disaster awaits them. In verse 10, it says they will be covered with shame and destroyed forever. We're told in verses 10 and 11 that because they stood by and watched all that happened to Israel, which is Jacob's family, that was just as bad as if Edom had done it to them themselves. This tension between the two brothers, Esau and Jacob, has been going on since they were conceived. Look back in Genesis 25, 22 to 23 for evidence of this. Then verses 12 to 14 caught my attention. They say, "You should not look down on your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster, nor look down on them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble." While reading this, it reminded me of envy. When we are envious of someone, aren't we a little bit pleased when misfortune comes to them? Like in verse 12, don't we rejoice, even just a little, over someone else's destruction? It sounds so ugly, but if we were honest, could we be accused of this as well? Verse 14 talks about waiting at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives and handing over survivors. Do we ever do this when we gossip? Do we wait to cut down people with our words, either to their face or behind their back, handing over innocent people? Then in verse 15, Obadiah includes all nations in his warning of what will happen if we are prideful, arrogant, and violent. This is where it gets personal. We read what will happen if we fall into this same sin. Our deeds will return upon our own heads. There are consequences if we continue to live in pride and say no to following God. That is the reality. Esau continued to live in sin, and look what happened. What does sin do to relationships with other people? What does sin do to our relationship with God? We are separated from God when we choose to live in sin. What we do or say behind people's backs or in front of them matters. It affects our relationships with them and our relationship with God. Thankfully, the book doesn't end there. I love the beginning of verse 17. It says, "But on Mount Zion will be deliverance." I am so thankful that our God never ends the story with destruction and ruin. He always offers deliverance. He always offers us a plan of redemption. Verse 17 ends with a promise. It will be holy, and the house of Jacob, meaning Jacob's family, will possess its inheritance. And that's how Obadiah ends his book, with a promise. And the kingdom will be the Lord's. What an encouragement this is to us. If we relate more closely to the Israelites, we can be sure there will be justice. If God is convicting you of your own sin and you see yourself in the Edomites, there's hope for forgiveness and deliverance for you too. This is the beauty and amazing gift our Father offers us through his Son. Thanks for joining us for this eGroup lesson. If you've missed and want to catch up on past lessons, visit eefc.ca/egroups. For now, let's get into the discussion questions.